The parking lot of the Rusty Anchor Diner sat quiet under a Georgia summer sky the color of a bruise. It was a Tuesday in late August, the kind of night where the heat does not break after sundown, where the air sits on your shoulders like something with weight and intention. Crickets worked the darkness beyond the gravel lot. A single sodium lamp buzzed above the entrance, casting a yellow cone on the cracked asphalt below. Then the vehicles arrived. Three black SUVs turned off Route 17 without slowing, moving in tight formation, the kind of spacing that does not happen by accident. They killed their headlights before they pulled in. No sirens, no flashers. They fanned into a semicircle across the lot's entrance with the quiet efficiency of something rehearsed 10,000 times in 100 different places. The engines died in near-perfect unison. For 2 seconds, nothing moved. Then the doors opened. 12 men stepped out into the Georgia night. Dark operational gear boots, bloused equipment strapped close to the body. They moved without speaking, spreading outward from the vehicles in a practiced sweep covering angles, checking distances, establishing positions. Not one of them looked at the diner's flickering sign. They were looking at everything else. The whole deployment from the moment the first door opened to the moment the last man took his position took less time than it takes to tie your shoes. The asset they had mobilized for was 26 years old. She weighed 119 pounds. She stood 5'3" in the work shoes she had been wearing for the last 6 hours. She had never worn a military uniform. She had never held a rank. Her name appeared in no system a civilian could access. She was also the most dangerous person inside that building. And she was the only one who had not thrown a single punch all night. Her name was Maren Calloway. To understand what she was doing in that diner, you have to understand who her father was. And to understand who her father was, you have to go back, not to wars or medals or the kind of stories that get written up in newspapers, but to a Tuesday afternoon 6 months earlier in a hospital room in Savannah that smelled of antiseptic and old flowers, where a 78-year-old man with hands like knotted rope reached out and held his daughter's wrist and made her promise him 2 things. But first, the diner. The Rusty Anchor had been sitting on the corner of Route 17 and Old Depot Road since 1971. The original owner had been a merchant marine named Clarence who had a thing for nautical decor and bad coffee. The coffee had improved over the decades. The decor had not. 4 plastic ship's wheels mounted behind the counter, a faded lighthouse print on the far wall, a glass case near the register holding antique brass compasses nobody ever looked at twice. The booths were red vinyl cracked along the seams in the way vinyl cracks when enough people carrying enough years have sat in it. Black and white tile floor. The lighting made everyone look like they had not slept. It was not a beautiful place, but it was an honest one. Bev Marsden had owned it for 11 years. She was 52, broad-shouldered, with gray streaking through dark hair. She kept pulled back in a way that suggested she had made that decision once and never revisited it. Her face had been handsome in her 30s and had grown into something better as it aged, something that had absorbed things without being broken by them. She ran the diner the way certain people run things, not loudly, not with policy, but with a clear and consistent understanding of what was acceptable and what was not. She had hired Maren Calloway 6 months ago, 3 weeks after Jack's funeral. Maren had walked in on a Thursday morning, sat at the counter, ordered coffee, and after she finished it, asked if Bev needed help. No resume, no explanation. She sat straight-backed on the counter stool with pale gray eyes that had a quality Bev hadn't been able to name at first. Later, she figured it out. They were observant, not suspicious, not guarded, quietly, constantly taking things in. Every customer who came through the door, every movement at the room's periphery, the eyes of someone who had learned somewhere and at some cost that awareness was not paranoia. Awareness was good sense. Bev said yes before the second cup was finished. It took 2 weeks to notice that Maren always chose a seat with her back to a wall, that she moved through a crowded diner in a particular order, never putting herself between 2 groups she didn't know, that she cleared the back corner booths far side first, working toward the exit, so she was never more than a few steps from open space. Bev said nothing about any of it. The girl showed up, on time, worked without complaint, remembered every regular's order after hearing it once, and never caused a moment of trouble. Some things you do not ask about. You make room for them. The other constant in Maren's evenings at the diner, without exception from 6 to 9, was Rufus Cade. Rufus was 71 years old, built like a man who had once been considerably larger and had not quite come all the way down. White mustache, thick forearms, and the kind of deliberate stillness that certain men develop after enough time in places where stillness was a survival mechanism. He always sat in the same booth, far left corner, back to the wall facing the door. Always ordered the same thing, black coffee and whatever pie Bev had made, even flavors he did not particularly like, which Marin had established within the first month because she paid attention. 15% tip, always in cash, always exact. In 11 years, Bev had learned almost nothing about Rufus Cade's past. She knew he had served. She knew it from the way he carried himself, the way he held space without taking it loudly, the way he could sit completely still for 45 minutes without once reaching for a phone or looking toward the door with impatience. She knew it from the small scar along his left jaw that disappeared into his collar. She had never asked. He had never offered. What neither Bev nor Marin knew was that Rufus had recognized something in the girl from the first evening she worked his section. Not her face, not her name. Something in how she moved. Something in the particular quality of her spatial awareness, the way she processed a room, the way trained people process rooms automatically and continuously, without effort and without interruption. He had not said anything. He had simply paid attention. On the slow evenings when Marin brought his coffee and sat for a moment at the end of his booth, he asked her things. Not personal questions. Questions like, what do you notice first when you walk into an unfamiliar room? What tells you a situation is about to change before it changes? She answered carefully, watching his face as she did. He would nod once and return to his pie. Neither of them put a name to what those conversations were. 6 months before that Tuesday night, the hospital room was on the 4th floor of Savannah Memorial. The window looked out onto a courtyard where a single live oak had been growing since the building was constructed in the 1960s. Jack Calloway had asked the nurses to keep the blinds open so he could see it. He liked the oak. He said it was honest. It did not try to be anything it wasn't. He was dying. He had been dying in the slow, accountable way that a body settles its debts after 78 years of extraordinary use. His hands still large, still carrying the architecture of the strength they had held rested on the hospital blanket with the care of things set down deliberately. His eyes were the same pale gray as Marin's, the inheritance obvious to anyone who looked, and they had lost none of their focus. She sat beside him every afternoon for 3 weeks. On the last afternoon he was fully conscious, he reached out and found her wrist. His grip was lighter than it had been, but it was present. The things I taught you, he said. His voice had grown quieter, but its precision was unchanged. Promise me they don't become who you are. They're tools, not an identity. She understood what he was asking. She had been able to read him her whole life with an accuracy that sometimes unsettled her because he was not an easy man to read, and she could do it almost perfectly. I promise, she said. He held her eyes. And call your mother when this is over. She worries. I know. Promise me. I promise. He nodded once, released her wrist, and turned back to the oak tree. 2 days later, he was gone. What Marin did not know was that the week before he was admitted, Jack Calloway had made a phone call, written a letter, and resubmitted a file he had first submitted 7 years earlier. The file concerned his daughter. It documented with the precision he had applied to everything in 40 years of professional life, a training program he had designed and conducted over 14 years, beginning when Marin was 12 and concluding just before her 20th birthday. It described her performance against metrics and benchmarks drawn from the same standards applied to the most demanding selection programs in the American military. It described completion of training, equivalent to basic underwater demolition qualification, survival and resistance protocols, advanced combat medicine, long-range marksmanship assessment, and close quarters evaluation under conditions Jack had designed to exceed standard parameters. The program had been conducted outside official channels at Jack's own initiative and expense over the objections of people who said it wasn't possible, wasn't appropriate, wasn't the way things were done. Jack Calloway had a particular relationship with that phrase. He had encountered it many times. He had never found it persuasive. The letter attached to the resubmission was 3 paragraphs. The last read, I am 78 years old and will not be available to advocate for this personally much longer. What is in this file is accurate and verifiable. I ask that it be reviewed on its merits. He signed it with his name and his rank. Master Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy, retired. Then he went to the hospital. He never came home. Marin knew none of this on the Tuesday evening the Road Kings pulled into the parking lot of the Rusty Anchor at 9:47. She heard the motorcycles before she saw them. 8 of them moving in the spread-out, staggered grouping of men who used their machines primarily as a statement. They were loud in the deliberate way, engines revving down rather than off, dragging the noise out as long as possible. Marin was wiping down the counter when she heard them. She did not turn immediately. She registered the sound, cataloged it, and continued what she was doing for 2 more seconds before she turned. 8 men, ages ranging from late 20s to mid-40s. Leather vests over dark shirts, the back panels bearing a red wolf's head and the words Road Kings in block lettering. The man who dismounted first was the largest 6'3", heavy through the shoulders, moving with the confidence of someone for whom size had gotten results in most situations for most of his life. His name stitched in red thread on his vest was Cage. Marcus Webb was 38 years old and had been running this chapter of the Road Kings for 4 years. He was not unintelligent. Unintelligent men rarely last long at the top of organizations like the Road Kings. He was perceptive, organized, and in his better moments possessed something that might fairly be called charisma. He also carried a rage that sat very close to the surface, pressurized and looking for release, finding it in whatever direction was most available on any given night. His brother Derek had been killed in Fallujah in 2004. 24 years old, a corporal in the Marine Corps by every account of the men who served with him, exactly the kind of soldier the country talked about on the holidays it designated for talking about such things. He came home in a flag-draped box and was buried in Augusta on a Thursday in November. His family received a folded flag, a handshake, and a pamphlet. Marcus had been 20 years old. He watched his brother become a symbol. He watched the symbol replace the person with considerable speed. He watched the systems that were supposed to help move their files and close their cases and consider the matter handled. He had never forgiven any of it. The rage had found its shape over 18 years. It had not become anything useful. It had become Cage. Come. The 8 men pushed through the diner's door at 9:49. Bev looked up from the register. Rufus in his corner booth looked up from his coffee. Marin behind the counter turned from the coffee station. 2 other customers were in the diner, a long-haul trucker working through a late dinner at the counter, and an older man in a booth near the window who looked at his plate and kept looking at it. Both of them registered the entrance and made the private calculation that people make in these moments. Cage led his group to the center tables. The others arranged themselves around 3 other tables, loud and careless chairs scraping jackets hitting tabletops. Marin picked up her order pad and came out from behind the counter. She approached the tables systematically, starting farthest from Cage. She took orders with the economy. She applied to everything, listened, wrote, confirmed, once moved on. She was aware of Cage watching her with the appraising quality that certain men apply to service workers with nothing to do with the service. She did not acknowledge it. She came to his table last. "What can I get you?" He looked her up and down. "You always work this late. What can I get you?" Same tone, same cadence. Something shifted in his expression. Not irritation yet, more like interest in her refusal to perform discomfort. "Coffee," he said, "and whatever's good. Pie, apple, or pecan?" "Pecan." She wrote it down and returned to the counter. Rufus had not resumed drinking his coffee. He sat with the flat, continuous attention of a man reading a situation before it fully declared itself. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. The Road Kings ate. They were loud but contained. The trucker settled his check and left. The older man near the window did the same. Now the diner held Bev, Marin, Rufus, and 8 Road Kings. The ratio shift was small, but it was real. Marin felt it. She noted it without changing anything about how she moved or what she did. It was Cage who changed the atmosphere. He stopped talking to his crew and started watching Marin again, but the quality of his attention had altered. She had stopped being something to look at and become something to test. He called her back for a coffee refill he did not need. She brought the pot. He said something while she poured low enough that only the nearest of his crew heard it, the kind of comment designed not to shock, but to diminish, to remind a person they can be seen a certain way if someone decides to see them that way. Marin finished pouring, set the pot down, looked at him once. "Anything else?" His eyes narrowed. He had expected something, embarrassment or its opposite. He had not expected nothing. He did not like nothing. The escalation happened by degrees, the way it always does when a man with a point to prove meets someone who refuses to give him the reaction that would let him feel he'd made it. He called her back twice more. He moved from the tables to the counter, planting himself on a stool, manufacturing reasons for her attention, with the persistence of a man who had a great deal of experience making other people uncomfortable. Bev moved to the register. Her hand came to rest on the counter near it, not obviously in the way a person's hand moves toward the things they might need. Rufus had set his cup down. He sat very still. The moment came at 10:17. Cage stood up from the stool and moved around the end of the counter, a line that represented a clear and deliberate crossing, and stepped into the space behind it, into the space where Marin was. His crew shifted at the tables, not standing, not yet, but attentive, in the way of a group recognizing when their principal is making a move. He reached out and caught the thin silver chain around Marin's neck. Not with force, with the deliberateness of someone demonstrating that they can. He pulled it forward. 2 things came with it. A dog tag, old and worn, the surface scratched from years of contact, the name Callaway J stamped into the metal. And when Marin's right hand instinctively came up, he saw the inside of her wrist. A small tattoo. Not a name, not an image. A series of numbers. Coordinates. He looked at them. He laughed dismissive. What is that, you some kind of soldier? He turned the dog tag over. Whose is this? My father's, Marin said. Your father. He held the tag. He know you're working in a diner. He's dead, she said. Cage held the tag a moment longer. His crew had gone quieter. In the far corner, Rufus had gone completely still, but it was not the stillness of inaction. It was the stillness of a man whose attention had been captured by something specific. His eyes had moved from the tall tag to the coordinates on Marin's wrist, and in those numbers, something had opened in him that had been closed for a long time. A grid reference, an island, October 1983. He had been 29 years old. Jack Calloway had been 33. A four-man element off communications in a situation that had deteriorated well beyond the parameters of its brief. He did not move. He said nothing. He filed the recognition away with the particular discipline of a man who has learned that the right moment to act is rarely the first moment you want to. Cage released the chain. The dog tag fell back against Marin's chest. He looked at her for a moment and then, without warning, grabbed the front of her shirt with both hands. The tear was loud in the quiet diner. The shirt opened at the collar, the seam ripping down several inches. The dog tag swung free. Marin's hands had come up not to fight a controlled response, not a flinch, and in that motion her right shoulder torqued at an angle she recognized the instant it happened. The surgical repair from 7 years ago. The old injury. It knew immediately. The pain was deep and specific. Not sharp. Settled. The kind that tells you it is staying. She lowered her hands. She looked at Cage with a composure so complete it appeared to confuse him. The absence of the reaction he had intended to produce again at a higher register. He stepped back slightly, looking at what he'd done. His crew was on their feet now. In the back office, Bev's hand had already found the register drawer. Not the cash register. The narrow one below it, where she kept a small laminated card that a man named Jack Calloway had placed in her hand on a Tuesday morning 6 months ago, 3 weeks before he went to the hospital. Call this if Marin's in real trouble, he had said. Not the police. This number. Tell them her name. She pulled the card. She pressed into the small back office, eased the door nearly shut, and dialed. It rang once. Operations, a man's voice said. Flat, professional, without warmth. My name is Bev Marsden. Her voice was low and tight. I own a diner in Savannah, Georgia. Route 17 in Old Depot Road. The Rusty Anchor. A breath. I'm calling about Marin Calloway. The silence that followed lasted less than 2 seconds. When the voice returned, something had entered it, not alarm, something colder and more focused. Is she injured? Not yet, Bev said, but there are 8 of them. Understood. Stay on the line. Don't go back into the room. We have your location. Through the gap of the office door, Bev could see a narrow slice of the diner. Marin behind the counter, still and straight, Cage in her space. Rufus in his corner, not moving but no longer simply watching. Present in the way a wall is present. She pressed her back against the office wall, card in one hand, phone in the other. And somewhere on the Virginia coast, in a building with no sign on the outside and a very specific kind of quiet inside, things began to move. The Naval Special Warfare Command Center at Dam Neck operated at its standard overnight, staffing a skeleton crew of analysts and watch officers, maintaining the continuous operational awareness that was simply part of what the facility did around the clock, without regard for what was happening in the rest of the world. Senior Chief Petty Officer Leonard Blake was 54 years old and had the particular constitution of a man who has learned to maintain precise internal calibration, regardless of external conditions. Not cold, not unfeeling, measured. Controlled in the way that a well-maintained instrument is controlled, because precision matters and imprecision costs things that do not come back. He was reviewing a logistics summary when the call came through. The analyst who flagged it leaned over without drama. Sir, Code Trident notification, civilian contact. Name given as Marin Calloway. Blake set down his pen. He sat for approximately 1 second processing what he had just heard in the particular way a man processes information when it connects to something he has been carrying for a long time. Then he stood and walked to the communications station with a pace that was not running but was not far from it. He listened to 30 seconds of the recording from the original contact. Then he turned to the watch officer. Commander Reed was 39 years old, lean through the jaw and shoulders with the kind of alertness that reads as permanent rather than situational. He read the situation in Blake's face before Blake said a word. Talk to me. Code Trident, active civilian assets, Savannah, Georgia. A beat. Name is Marin Calloway. Reed held Blake's gaze. Jack's daughter. Yes, sir. Something moved through Reed's expression. Not dismissal, not quite skepticism. The particular caution of a man who respects a legend and is therefore more careful, not less, about anything connected to it. Jack Calloway had been a name in Reed's professional education before it was a name in his operational life. A figure encountered through training doctrine, then through institutional memory, the kind of man whose methods were still embedded in programs he had had no direct hand in for 20 years. Jack's daughter was a different proposition. "She's a waitress," Reed said, not unkindly, flatly. "She is currently," Blake said. "Come look at this." Reed followed him to the workstation. Blake opened a file. Reed stood behind Blake's shoulder and read in silence. A minute passed, then another. He reached the assessment section. He stopped. He went back and read it again. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Then get me the QRF." Blake had already reached for the phone. In a building 200 yards away, 12 men at various stages of late evening routine came awake and began to move. No alarm. The notification came through a specific channel in a specific format, and the men in that room knew what it meant before they finished reading it. The youngest of them was Cord Harker, 24 years old, 18 months out of training on his second operational rotation. Not the loudest in the room, not the most decorated. When the name Calloway appeared in the notification, he stopped what he was doing for precisely 2 seconds before continuing. His father had told him about Jack Calloway. Not once, many times, in the way certain stories get told because they need to be carried, because the person telling them knows they will not always be there to carry them alone. Ray Harker had described the operation in October 1983 with the precision of a man who had memorized every detail because it was the most important night of his life. He had told Cord the name of the man who had made the decision that kept Ray alive. He had said it with a quality in his voice that Cord had learned over years of hearing. It was the closest his father came to reverence. Cord had grown up understanding what that meant. Not abstractly, he existed because of a decision Jack Calloway had made. He finished lacing his boots and said nothing to the men around him. He strapped his gear and moved with the others toward the vehicles. Back in the diner, time had taken on the quality it takes on when a situation is narrowing toward a point. Cage had not left. After the tear, he had stepped back, but stepping back was not leaving, and the energy in the room had not dissipated. It had changed registers. His crew was on their feet, standing in the loose, ready way of men waiting to see what their leader does next. The diner, which had never been large, felt smaller. Marin stood behind the counter. The torn collar of her shirt lay open at the throat. The dog tag caught the overhead light. Her right shoulder had a quality to it, now a slight unevenness in how she held it, that she was controlling carefully enough that no one without a reason to look would notice. She had a reason to look. She was looking, and she knew what it meant. The shoulder had been surgically repaired at 19 following a training incident that Jack had documented with clinical precision. Something had shifted tonight under the torque of a reflex she had not been able to fully suppress. Not broken, shifted. It would not shift back on its own. She stood with both hands visible on the counter surface, not gripping, resting. She was doing something that from the outside looked like nothing. Reading the room, not emotionally, not socially, but geometrically. Angles of approach, points of convergence. The two narrow gaps between the tables through which Cage's crew would have to funnel if they moved toward the back. The distance from where Cage stood to the front door. The position of each man relative to the others. She was not planning to fight. She had made a promise. She intended to keep it. But she was positioning herself along the counter in small, natural-looking adjustments. If something happened to Bev, the angles would matter. Not to fight, to move. Jack had called this passive geometry. He had introduced the concept when she was 16 in a parking lot on a Saturday morning and made her explain it back to him in her own words before they drove home. Cage moved, not toward Marin. He walked along the near side of the counter toward the office door, a slow, deliberate walk that said, "I know what's back here." "Who's in the back?" he said. Marin came around the counter towards him. Not fast, steady, placing herself between him and the office door in a movement that appeared so natural it took a moment to register as deliberate. "Nobody," she said. "Then you won't mind if I check." Two of his crew had moved up behind him. Marin did not step back. She held his eyes. What she felt in that moment was not fear. Though the elements of fear were present, elevated pulse, the particular clarity of adrenaline perception, narrowing to the immediately relevant. What she felt was something more specific. Two things pulling against each other with equal force. The promise made in a hospital room 6 months ago, and the knowledge of what was behind the office door and what would happen to Bev if she stepped aside. She did not move. Cage looked at her for a moment. Then he raised his hand, put it flat against her chest, not a shove yet, a displacement, and pushed her sideways. That was when Rufus stood up. He was on his feet before his chair had stopped moving. He crossed the diner with the careful efficiency of a man whose body carries the accumulated record of decades not slow but deliberate in the way of someone who has learned the difference between speed and control. He put himself between Cage and the office door, not grandstanding, just present. "That's enough," Rufus said. Cage looked at him with the contempt that certain men reserve for opposition they find both unexpected and beneath them. He stepped forward and put both hands on the old man's shoulders and shoved. Rufus went down. He hit the floor between the counter and the nearest table, his left side taking the impact, his leg catching the table leg at an angle that was immediately audibly wrong. Not the sound of a break, the sound of something older giving way. The scar tissue along the outside of his left thigh accumulated from a piece of shrapnel on a small Caribbean island in October 1983 tore along its established line as the leg buckled. The blood came through his trouser leg within seconds, dark and certain. Rufus did not make a sound. He put his hand flat on the floor, pushed himself partway up, then stopped because the leg would not cooperate, and he assessed what he had to work with. Marin was beside him before the situation had fully declared itself to the rest of the room. She did not run. Running in a room with 8 men whose attention you are managing is an announcement. She moved quickly and with purpose, but smoothly, in a way that read as the automatic response of a woman rushing to help a fallen customer, which was true as far as it went. She got her hands on him, assessed his position, registered the blood on his trouser leg, and understood immediately what she was dealing with. She called to Bev through the cracked office door, short, calm, no panic in it. "Bev, first aid kit under the counter, now." The kit came through the gap, Bev pushing it without showing herself the way a person passes something through a closing door in a burning building. Marin caught it without looking because she was tracking the room. She opened the kit on the floor. She found the tourniquet, standard cat, the same type she had trained on for 2 years, and she began. Her hands moved with the quality that belongs to accuracy rather than haste. The tourniquet went around the upper thigh positioned above the injury with precision. The windlass turned. The strap drew tight. She checked the placement, adjusted by half an inch, tightened again. 28 seconds from the moment she opened the kit to the moment she called it done. Rufus looked at her hands during those 28 seconds. He felt the pressure build at the correct rate, felt the tourniquet seat itself at exactly the tension required. He had worn one of these before. He knew the difference between one applied by someone who had been taught and one applied by someone who had done it until it was part of how their hands understood the world. He looked at her face. She was focused on the work, the appropriate direction of attention during a medical procedure. As she checked the final position and sat back to assess, he found her eyes. "Those are a soldier's hands," he said. His voice was steady despite everything. Marin looked at him for one full second. She held his gaze with the expression of someone acknowledging that a thing has been seen and does not need to be denied or confirmed. Then she turned back to the room. Cage had not moved toward her. The speed and precision of what she'd just done had produced a pause in him, not softening, not reflection, just the instinctive recalibration of a man who has encountered something that doesn't match his working model. 2 of his crew were watching Marin with expressions that had changed. Cage recovered. He stepped forward, grabbed Marin's upper arm, and pulled her to her feet. The motion torqued the right shoulder again. The pain came back with the specificity of something that has already assessed the territory and knows exactly where to apply pressure. She absorbed it. She had been absorbing pain since she was 12 years old, and her father had introduced her to the distinction between discomfort as information and discomfort as instruction. She stood in Cage's grip and looked at him. She thought about the hospital room, the promise, the specific weight of it in the specific moment it was made. She kept it. It was costing her something real and permanent. She kept it anyway. Then the sound came from outside. Cage and his crew had no reference for that sound. 3 high-performance vehicles entering a parking lot in tight formation without slowing, moving with the coordinated precision of something that had been rehearsed in very different places for very different purposes. A quality to the engine sound suggesting weight and intention, and the complete absence of any desire to make an impression. These vehicles were not arriving to be noticed. They were arriving to accomplish something. The engine stopped. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. Cage's hand loosened on Marin's arm without him deciding to loosen it. His head turned toward the front windows. His crew turned with him, the collective attention of the room shifting toward the exterior without direction. 3 black SUVs sat in a semicircle across the lot's entrance. Their doors opened together. 12 men stepped out. They moved with the economy of people who have nothing to prove in this parking lot or any other. They spread from the vehicles quickly and without noise, establishing positions covering the building's exterior, the road access, the side alley. They wore dark operational gear. They carried themselves with a quality different from police officers, different from security personnel, different from anything the Road Kings had a framework for, which was itself a piece of information. The last man out of the vehicles was Commander Reed. He stood beside the lead SUV for a moment, taking in the exterior of the building. Not large, medium height, lean, nothing physically overwhelming. What he had was an absolute absence of uncertainty. He looked at the diner the way a man looks at a problem he has already solved. He walked toward the door. Reed pushed the diner door open and stood in the entrance. His eyes moved through the room, comprehensive and fast, not performing. He cataloged the Road Kings, distributed his threat assessment across the 8 men registered Cage, with Marin's arm in his grip. He registered the torn collar of her shirt. He registered the man on the floor. Then his gaze moved past Marin. He was looking for someone carrying a certain kind of presence. Older. He didn't find it. He looked at Blake. Blake was looking at the floor near the counter. Reed followed Blake's look and found Marin, who had pulled free of Cage's loosened grip and returned to Rufus's side, one hand on the tourniquet, checking its position. Reed looked at her, at the 26-year-old waitress in the torn shirt kneeling on a diner floor beside a bleeding man, her hands steady on a correctly applied tourniquet. He looked at the tourniquet with the attention of a man who knows the difference between one done correctly and one done approximately. "Where's Calloway?" he said. The question addressed the room. From the floor, without looking up, Rufus Cade pointed. He pointed at Marin. Reed looked at her for a moment. Then he walked forward, not to Cage, not to anyone else, and went down on one knee across from her on Rufus's other side. He looked at the tourniquet. He looked at Rufus's color. He looked at the angle of the strap, the placement of the windlass, the tension. "When did this go on?" he asked Marin. "Approximately 8 minutes ago," she said. She was watching Rufus's color, which was holding. Reed examined the placement with 2 fingers. He did not adjust it. He pulled his hand back. He looked at Marin with an expression that was not warm and was not cold and was not what it had been 20 minutes ago when Blake first said her name to him in the command center. He nodded, once. Then he stood and turned to face Cage. What followed was administrative in the way that certain things become administrative once the authority in the room has been fully established. Reed did not raise his voice. He did not make speeches. He looked at Cage with the expression of a man performing the final step of a calculation that reached its conclusion long ago, and he said quietly, "You put your hands on a protected asset. You physically assaulted a civilian. Put your hands where my people can see them." Cage held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he put his hands forward. His crew followed within moments the way groups follow when the center has moved. In his corner, Cord Harker had positioned himself against the wall, watching without moving. He had watched Reed cross to Marin. He had watched the tourniquet assessment. He had watched Reed nod. He was watching Marin now, where she remained beside Rufus, one hand resting on the old man's arm, talking to him in the low, steady register people use to keep someone calm and grounded until more help arrives. He had counted the 28 seconds automatically. He had men in his unit who had trained medical response longer than Marin Calloway had been alive. Not all of them came in under 30 on a first application. Not all of them came in under 30 on their best application. He said nothing. He filed it away. As Cage was being guided toward the door he passed within a few feet of Marin, he stopped, or was allowed to stop, for a brief moment. He looked down at her. His expression had changed. The rage was still present, but it had something else in it now, something more complicated and less comfortable. Marin looked at him without hostility and without pity. "Your brother served," she said. Her voice was level. "He deserved more than what they gave him after." "That's true." She held his gaze. "But he wouldn't want this to be what you became." Cage's jaw worked once. He looked at her for another second and then looked away. Not in the direction of a man who has dismissed something, but in the direction of a man who cannot look at something directly. He was taken through the door. The ambulance arrived 11 minutes after Rufus went down. In those 11 minutes, the diner existed in the suspended state that settles over a place after something has moved through it. Reed's men maintained their positions. Bev came out of the back office slowly, the way a person moves after holding themselves compressed for a long time. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum, then went to get a clean cloth and a glass of water, because that was what she knew how to do. Marin stayed beside Rufus. He lay with his back against the counter, left hand resting on the floor beside him, eyes on the ceiling. His color was holding, his breathing was even. After a moment, he said quietly and without looking at her, "I knew your father." Marin was still for a beat. "I know," she said. He turned his head and looked at her. Something moved in his expression that did not need naming. He looked at her for a long moment, the way a man looks at the continuation of something he had not expected to see continue. Then he closed his eyes and waited for the ambulance. The unit's corpsman examined Marin's shoulder with the methodical care of someone who works from evidence rather than reassurance. He moved through the range of motion assessment without talking, asking her to stop, when it was uncomfortable quantifying the stop points. When he finished, he stood in front of her and gave her the finding directly because her face told him she wanted it directly. The surgical repair from 7 years ago had held in its primary structure. The posterior capsule, the connective tissue supporting the joint's rear range of motion, had sustained significant re-injury. The muscle damage would respond to treatment. The capsule damage was permanent. He gave her the number she asked for: 30 to 35% loss of right shoulder range of motion, permanent, not recoverable with current surgical options. He said it without softening it. She absorbed it completely without performance. She looked at the shoulder for a moment, then she looked at him. "What do I need to do in the next 24 hours? He told her. She listened. She nodded at the appropriate points. She thanked him with the brevity of someone who means it and does not require it to be more than what it is. After he stepped away, she stood behind the counter alone for a moment. 30 to 35%. She worked through what that meant, not in terms of grief. Grief could come later, but practically. The promise she had made to her father meant she had already chosen not to deploy the full range of what the shoulder represented. What the shoulder had lost was not her identity. It was a range of options inside an identity she had chosen not to inhabit. She sat with this for a minute and found that it settled the way hard things settle when you approach them honestly, with weight, with cost, but without the additional burden of resistance. Blake separated from Reed and walked toward the counter. He stopped in front of Marin. He looked at her for a moment with the appraising attention of a man confirming something he already suspected to be true. Then he reached into the interior pocket of his jacket. He brought out an envelope, standard-sized government weight paper, folded once lengthwise at some point in its past, the crease old, not recent, and then kept flat. The edges had softened. One corner held a small compression mark from repeated contact with something. It was an envelope that had been carried. He set it on the counter in front of her. "Your father resubmitted your recognition file the week before he was admitted to the hospital," Blake said. "Even factual, no adornment. The Chief of Naval Operations reviewed the file and signed off on it 22 days ago." He paused once. "We've had 3 people trying to locate you since then." Marin looked at the envelope without touching it. The return address was printed in small type, office of the Chief of Naval Operations, Washington, D.C. Her name was on the front, handwritten in a script she recognized. She had grown up reading it on training assessments and notes left on the kitchen table and cards tucked into books he thought she should read. Jack had addressed the envelope himself. She picked it up and opened it cleanly. She pulled out the document and read it. It was not long. The language was precise and institutional, and capable, when you understood what it was saying, of carrying a weight entirely disproportionate to its length. She read it once, then she went back to the second paragraph and read it again, not because she had not understood it the first time, but because certain things need to be given a second moment. When she set it down, her face held the quality of someone receiving confirmation of something they had at some level always suspected might never come. Not relief exactly, the settling of a long-held weight. The particular stillness of a person who has been carrying something at a sustained angle for so long that when they are finally allowed to set it down, they stand for a moment adjusting to the absence of it. She did not cry. She looked at Blake. "He knew," she said. "He submitted the original file when you were 23, Blake said. "He never stopped pursuing it." She nodded once, slow. Blake held her gaze for a moment more. Something in his expression had not been there when he arrived, something older and more settled. Something that might have looked from the outside like a man seeing a face he has long known and is meeting in person for the first time. "He told me about you," Blake said. "Silom. Twice in person. He was not a man who spoke easily about personal matters." "No," Marin said. "He wasn't. He was proud of you in a way that embarrassed him." Blake paused, which meant it was real. The corner of Marin's mouth moved slightly in the direction of something. "I know," she said. Blake inclined his head once and stepped back. Cord Harker was the last man inside. He moved through the diner's final minutes without drawing attention to himself, which was not difficult because Cord moved through most spaces that way. He was 24 years old and had already learned what took some people decades: that presence does not require volume, that observation is more useful than announcement, that the things worth paying attention to are happening at the edges of a situation, not its center. He had watched the edges all evening. He had watched Marin apply the tourniquet and counted the seconds. He had watched her stand between Cage and the office door and not move. He had watched her absorb the shoulder and continue. He had watched her receive the envelope and open it and fold it back along its crease with the same hands that had applied a correctly tensioned tourniquet 20 minutes before. He moved toward the door. At the door, he stopped. He turned around. Marin was behind the counter looking at him. For a moment, they were simply two people in a diner at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, looking at each other across a room that had been through something. He was in operational gear. She was in a torn shirt with her apron still on Jack's dog tag against her collarbone. Cord raised his right hand. He brought two fingers to his forehead, not the sharp, full palm formality of an official salute. Something smaller. The two-finger acknowledgement that belongs to a community that communicates in a register most people never learn to read. He held it for a moment, then he lowered his hand and walked out the door. Marin stood behind the counter. Her right hand came up. Two fingers touched her forehead. She held them there for a beat, looking at the closed door. Then she lowered her hand. The months that followed had the texture of things returning to their ordinary dimensions after a period of extraordinary compression. Rufus was on the third floor of Savannah Memorial, in a room that looked out onto a parking structure, which he was treating with the same equanimity he applied to everything that could not be changed. He was sitting up in the bed with a cup of bad coffee he was finishing on principle when Marin came in the morning after. He looked at her and said without preamble, "Sit down." She pulled the chair. She sat. He looked at her shoulder, the way she held it, the slight protective tilt. He did not comment. They had already established the permanent nature of it, and that establishment was complete. He looked at the window for a moment. Then he said, "I want to tell you about your father, before I lose the inclination." He told her about October 1983. Not a summary, the actual account with the specificity of a man who has carried a story for 40 years and knows every detail, because accuracy is the only form of respect that endures. A four-man element off communications on a small island. A situation deteriorated well beyond the parameters of the brief. Two legitimate options with no clearly correct answer, and a man who made a decision inside 90 seconds with no performance, no hesitation, no requirement for anyone to see him make it. "I have thought about those 90 seconds more times than I can count," Rufus said. Not the decision itself, the quality of how he made it, the complete absence of anything except the problem and its solution. He turned the coffee cup in his hands without drinking from it. He moved us. He was right. But it was not a certain call, and he knew it wasn't. He made it anyway. He looked at her. "You have that," he said. "Last night, 8 men in the room, a compromised shoulder, a promise pulling against a practical necessity, and you did not perform anything. You assessed, you positioned, you moved." He held her gaze with the flat, direct attention she had come to understand as his highest register. "That is not something I can teach. Your father had it. It came through." She looked at the foam wedge under his leg. She received what he'd said fully without deflecting or reducing it because it deserved to be received that way. "He never said that to me directly," she said. "No," Rufus said, "he wouldn't." A pause. "He sent me a letter 8 months ago, 3 pages. He wrote about you, not your capability, what you were." He set the cup down. "There is one sentence I have been deciding whether to tell you." She looked at him. He wrote, "She has never once asked me what I did or who I was before she knew me, and somehow that has taught me more about character than anything I encountered in 40 years of professional life." The room held that sentence for a long moment. Marin looked at the window. She thought about her father at the kitchen table, the particular quality of his silences, the way he communicated through precision and omission, the way he had never once said directly what he thought of her in terms she could have quoted back. "He wrote it to you," she said slowly, "because if he wrote it to me, it would become something I had to perform to." "Yes," Rufus said, "that is exactly right." She sat with him for another hour. He told her 3 things about that night in 1983 that she would carry for the rest of her life. She told him one thing about Jack that she had never told anyone about a morning when she was 17 and had failed a navigation assessment 3 times in a row, and Jack had sat across from her in complete silence for 20 minutes before saying, "You already know what you did wrong, so I won't waste either of our time." Rufus listened. "Yes," he said when she finished. "That's exactly him. 4 words, enough." She drove back to Savannah after through the older parts of the city, past the squares maintained with the civic commitment of a place that understands the value of living things that outlast their planners. She drove without music and let the shoulder be there, present and permanent, having earned the right to be present and permanent. 3 days after the incident, Commander Reed called. She was in the back office of the diner eating lunch at Bev's desk. She answered because she had been expecting it. He did not open with pleasantries. "I want to say something outside any official capacity," he said. "I reviewed your father's file for the first time at 11 o'clock at night, and I had a position before I walked through that door. I am telling you this so you have an accurate account of what happened." "I know what happened," she said. "I know you do. I am telling you because The record matters to me. A brief pause. He submitted the original file 7 years ago. I read his letter after we returned. I should have read it before coming in. He paused once more. He was right about everything in it. She thought about the quality of those words, not their content, which she already knew, but how they were delivered. Flat, direct, unornamented. A man correcting his own record because accuracy required it, not because the correction benefited him. "Thank you," she said. "Yes," Reed said. The call ended. She held the phone for a moment. Then she finished her lunch and went back out front. The package from Cord Parker arrived in the first week of December. It came to the diner in handwriting that was clean and economical. The return address was a P.O. box in Virginia Beach. Inside, a photograph and a note card. The photograph was black and white, slightly overexposed in the way of a picture taken quickly in the field. Two men in an exterior setting low-light the suggestion of operational gear vegetation behind them. On the back, in ink faded to brown, Callaway. Harker, October '83. The note card had 4 sentences. "My father kept this until he died. He told me to find the right person to give it to. I don't think he meant me to keep it. He would have wanted it with someone who understood what it was a picture of." She read the note card twice. She turned the photograph and looked at the two men. The leaner of them had the clear, flat eyes she had grown up seeing across every table in her life. He looked nothing like her, and entirely like her. She understood now what she had not fully understood the night of the incident. Rufus Cade and Ray Harker had both been in that operation in October 1983. A 4-man element. Jack had made decisions that night that moved in more than one direction and landed in more than one life. The reach of a single decision, correctly executed under pressure, does not always stay visible in its full extent. Some of it travels 40 years through a son who enlists because of a story his father told and shows up in a diner on a Tuesday night to confirm a tourniquet and mails a photograph in December because keeping it is not the right thing, and he knows it. She set the photograph against the lamp on the table beside her bed. Not framed, just there, present the way he had been present. The physical therapy started in January with a practitioner named Hendricks, 61 years old, who had worked with military personnel for most of her career and had the specific unsentimental competence that this produced. She assessed the shoulder in the first session, gave Marin the number directly because Marin asked for it directly, and described exactly what the work could and could not accomplish. Marin found it acceptable. The ledger of loss was real and had to be acknowledged, but it was a record, not a residence. Her father had been clear about this distinction since she was old enough to understand it. In their 4th session, Hendricks paused mid-assessment and said that the baseline proprioceptive awareness in Marin's body was unlike anything she encountered outside formal athletic training. She asked about background. Marin said her father had been thorough. Hendricks said that was an understatement. They continued. It was a productive relationship. Rufus was discharged on the 14th day and came back to the diner on a Thursday, which was not one of his established days. He sat in his corner. She brought coffee. They did not discuss the deviation. The legal process moved with the unhurried institutional momentum of a system that has processed a great many cases. Cage's charges were not complicated. The physical evidence, witness accounts, and documentation from Reed's unit aligned without ambiguity. His public defender was competent and realistic and advised him accordingly. He entered a guilty plea in mid-October and appeared for sentencing in November before Judge Patricia Wren of the Chatham County Superior Court, who had been on the bench for 19 years and had the disposition of a judge who has heard every variety of human circumstance and extends to none of them either romance or contempt. What Marin did not know until Bev mentioned it, having read it in the local paper's court summary, was that Marcus Webb had asked to make a statement before sentencing. He was not required to. He stood and spoke for approximately 4 minutes about his brother Derek, about what the systems had and had not provided his family, about what he understood, now that he had not understood before. He spoke by all accounts of those present without performance. He did not ask for mercy. In the last paragraph of his statement, he asked that resources for families in the position his had been in be made more visible, more accessible, and more real. The judge had reviewed her notes after he sat down. Then she said briefly that she took the statement into account in the way it was intended, and that she hoped he understood the distinction between explanation and excuse because his statement had been the former. He received 14 weeks with credit for time served plus 2 years probation. On a Tuesday afternoon in late November in the parking lot of a strip mall on the south side of Savannah, Marin walked out of a pharmacy and saw Marcus Webb pushing a flatbed cart out of the building next door. He was thinner. The physical bulk was still there, but it sat differently on him, looser, the way size sits on a person when the aggression that once held it in place has been at least partially redirected. His face was drawn in the way of someone who has spent time with an uncomfortable thought and has not looked away from it. He saw her from 20 feet and stopped. He stood in that parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon and looked at the woman who had said the one thing he had not been able to put down in 4 months. Your brother wouldn't want this to be what you became. He had thought about it with resentment, first then without resentment, which was harder and took longer and felt worse and was the more useful of the two. He had thought about Derek not as a symbol, as a 24-year-old in Augusta who ate cereal standing over the sink on weekday mornings and had a particular laugh that Marcus could still reproduce exactly in his memory note for note. He gave a short nod, not practiced, not smooth. The nod of someone doing the right thing badly because they cannot yet do it well. Marin looked at him for a moment. She nodded back, steady, clear, without warmth she hadn't earned, or coldness she didn't need to deliver. An acknowledgement. A door left where it was available when something on the other side was ready to move. She went into the pharmacy. He pushed his cart to his car. On the first Tuesday of the new year, Marin arrived at the diner at her usual time. She came through the back, hung her coat, tied her apron. She touched her apron pocket once the folded document was there as it had been for 5 months, carried in the same pocket with her order pad and a pen with a cracked cap and Jack's dog tag. She had not moved the document to a frame or a file or any more official location. It was there, which was where it needed to be. Close. She came out front. Rufus was in his corner. She set his cup out. She refilled the sugar caddies and reset the counter stools and moved through the standard opening tasks of a Tuesday evening shift. At 6:01, the bell above the door rang. Rufus came through. He was moving well tonight, the brace apparently off, or at least no longer affecting his gait the way it had in the early weeks. He moved through the diner toward his corner with the quality of a man returning to a room that is his not by ownership but by long familiarity, which is a different and more durable form of possession. He sat. She brought to the coffee. He looked at the chair across the table with the particular intention she had come to recognize, not an observation, an invitation. She pulled the chair out. She sat. They did not speak immediately because neither of them needed to establish the conversation before having it. Rufus drank his coffee. She poured her own. The diner held its ordinary sounds: kitchen counter, the bell for another customer, the coffee maker's steady hiss. After a while, Rufus set his cup down and looked at the table. I want to tell you something I've been sitting with, he said. She waited. When I was on that floor, he said, he always said it that way, as though it happened last night, because some things stay in the present tense indefinitely. When you were applying that tourniquet, I knew 2 things in that moment. He looked at his hands on the table. I knew your father's work when I felt it. The placement, the tension, the timing. I knew those were his hands working through yours. He was quiet a beat, and I understood something about the whole of it, about what he did in 1983 and what he did over 14 years with you. 2 decisions, same quality, same absence of any requirement for acknowledgement. He looked at her. He was the most consistent person I ever encountered. In 40 years of knowing people who had been tested, I never met another one like him. Marin looked at the table. She thought about her father, the precise silences, the refusal to belabor, the way he communicated through the quality of what he did rather than what he said about it. He would have been uncomfortable hearing that, she said. Yes, Rufus said, which is how I know it's accurate. She looked at him. He leaned back slightly in his booth. His bad leg was extended under the table, the brace showing at the cuff of his trouser leg. He looked at her with the flat, appraising attention that was his version of directness, which was already more direct than most people's most direct moments. What are you going to do? He said. It was not a question she had been avoiding. It was a question she had been working toward at the pace that honest answers require. And she had arrived at the answer in the weeks since the incident with the same deliberateness she applied to everything that mattered. She reached into her apron pocket. She pulled out the folded document and set it on the table between them, not unfolded, not displayed, just present. Then she pulled out the mowing tag and set it beside it. She looked at both objects for a moment. The document with the CNO's signature and her father's handwriting on the envelope. The dog tag worn smooth at the edges from decades of contact. She picked up the dog tag and put it back around her neck. She left the document on the table. I have 35% less range of motion than I had in August, she said. I have a documented record of 14 years of my father's most careful work. I have a permanent must, and I have a tool I promised not to use as an identity. She met Rufus's eyes. I'm going to find out what's possible with what I have. Not what I had, what I have. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. The nod of a man who has received an accurate and complete answer and has no addition to make to it. Your father, he said, spent his entire career doing exactly that. She held his gaze. I know, she said. She stood. She retied her apron. She picked up the order pad from beside the sugar caddy and turned to a fresh page. The following morning, she drove to a building on the south side of Savannah. She had looked up the address of the night before. It was plain functional with no remarkable exterior. Inside a front desk, a waiting area, a woman who asked her name and gave her a form. The form was for an intake appointment with the Veterans Transition Assistance Program's Civilian Liaison Office, a program that worked with service and training organizations in an advisory capacity, drawing on documented competencies. Not a military application, not a reinstatement. The first step of a process she had thought about for months, turning it over at the pace required for honest evaluation. She sat in the waiting area. She looked at the form. She filled it out in the economical handwriting that was hers and had always been hers, that looked nothing like Jack's and had learned everything from him. She dated it. She set the pen down. Through the window at the end of the waiting area, Savannah was doing what it always did, existing with the patient permanence of a place that has seen a great deal and understood that continuation is its own form of statement. The live oaks along the street were beginning their spring flush new growth, coming in at the edges, the old structure holding steady beneath it. They grew slowly and they grew long, and they did not apologize for either. Marin picked up the form. She walked to the desk. She handed it in. The dog tag rested against her sternum, cool and worn, the name stamped into its surface as legible as the day it was made. She had carried it for 6 months every day, in every room, and it had never once felt like grief. It felt like what it was, a piece of a man she had known completely carried forward into whatever came next in the only way that mattered. Not as a memorial, as a direction. She walked out into the Georgia morning, where the light was the clean quality of a season committed to beginning, and she turned toward the car and she drove back toward the diner, where Bev would be unlocking the back door and Rufus would come in at 6 o'clock, and the work of the ordinary day would be waiting patient and reliable, the way the ordinary day always waits for the people who have learned to live inside it without being diminished by it. She drove without music. She did not look in the rearview mirror.